Welcome to this afternoon's session. My name is Conrad Stoesz. I'm the archivist at the Mennonite Heritage Archives here in Winnipeg. I'm chairing this session. We have 4 presenters for this afternoon. Martin will be by video link. Our first presenter is Donald Stoesz. He's worked for 35 years as a federal prison chaplain in Quebec and Alberta. He's an ordained minister with Mennonite Church Alberta. He graduated in 1991 from McGill University with a PhD in religious studies. The second presenter is Delwin Epp. He's the third of 5 children born to Edgar and Leona Epp, both alumni of Canadian Mennonite Bible College. Edgar, his father, was prominent in the provincial corrections during the 60s, 70s, and 80s, as will be presented today. Delwin wanted to be a farmer, like his grandparents, but settled for a career in agricultural plant sciences, working for the University of Saskatchewan, private industry, and finally with the federal government. He's been married for 43 years to his wife Lois, raised 3 sons, and they are both retired and enjoying their grandchildren. Our third presenter is Emmanuel Gonzalez Montañez. He's a PhD candidate in educational research at the Center for Research Advanced Studies in Mexico City. His research examines Mennonite education, religious identity, and the intersections of school, church, and state institutions in northern Mexico. He also serves as principal of the Spanish language mission school in Las Uagas, and has occasionally participated in the evangelistic prison group, which is the focus of his presentation at this conference. And the fourth presenter is Martin Eitzen, born and raised in Paraguay, studied theology in Buenos Aires, Argentina, and in Fresno, California. He holds a PhD in intercultural studies from Trinity Evangélico Divinity School. He's been on the faculty of the School of Theology of the Evangelical University of Paraguay for almost 30 years. He's the founding director of the Aquila and Priscilla Institute. For 15 years, he was the mission pastor of the Concordia MB Church in Asunción, and as such was responsible for the prison ministry in the National Penitentiary of Tacumbú. He's married to Betty for 36 years, and together they have 3 sons, 2 daughters, and 1 granddaughter. All right. Looking forward to this session, and we'll start with Don.
Thank you very much for having me. It's really great to be part of a broader community involved in justice. I really enjoyed the conference. I'll be summarizing my article today. And in part, it's based on a book I published last year called Transformative Moments in Chaplaincy, which looks at 50 years of justice reform as well as 50 years of volunteers involved in the justice system. I'm building on that today with a few new insights and looking specifically at Mennonites. I found it quite ironic that Mennonites, as an egalitarian society committed to the priesthood of all believers and involved in visitation as well as evangelism, would be involved in a correctional service that is really a military operation. It's kind of the opposite of what Mennonites tend to believe. And the correctional service was a military operation very much in the 1950s and 60s, chain of command, and it was kind of a private society in a sense that it was seen that volunteers and visitors were not really encouraged to come. The military operation runs its own business. It doesn't need the interference of the public, and its purpose is to keep criminals, the offenders behind bars, and that's about it. What happened in the 50s and 60s and 70s is that there was a lot of violence in Canadian jails. There were a lot of inmate killings. There were quite a few killings of staff, including some wardens that were killed. And so the Correctional Service realized that they had to have a different idea of how they run their business. And in the 1980s, they adopted a mission statement in which they transformed understanding of corrections from punishment to rehabilitation. And in their mission statement, they put the offender, giving the offender the opportunity to change as the primary focus of corrections, and that is done within the framework of humane control called a prison. That was quite, I think, revolutionary. They were able to make this work through two other principles: dynamic security and subsidiarity. Dynamic security refers to the fact that staff have direct contact with inmates, and it is precisely the modeling that staff have of resolving conflicts and engaging verbally to de-escalate violent situations or threats is a way that then the institution would be safe. There's a story going around when I was a chaplain, was that there was a correctional officer. He was being interviewed by the HR department for a job at corrections, and so they kept asking him questions, and halfway through the interview he says, "What? I have to work with inmates?" His idea was, of course, that the static security, as opposed to dynamic security, refers to the fences and the guns, the locks in the cells, the locks on the units. If there's a riot, there's lockdowns in different hallways, etc., etc. Often officers work behind a bubble and glass, and there's a separation there. And so the shift was from from static security, an emphasis on static security, to dynamic security. The senior correctional officers, the managers, said that the most important employee in the service is the frontline worker who works directly with inmates and works to solve conflicts. The second principle of subsidiarity states that all conflicts should be solved at the lowest level possible. So if it's between an inmate and an inmate, that hopefully can be resolved without asking somebody else to get involved, between an inmate and a staff, between a staff and a staff. And so informal resolution is often applied, that there's a resolution of a lot of things that are going on. We don't have to go to formal resolution, and we don't have to go to the next level of authority, because of course it's still a chain of command from the commissioner to the warden to the deputy warden, assistant warden, correctional managers, correctional officers, parole officers, program officers, social workers. Oh yeah, right, elders and chaplains there somewhere in the end. So, how does that work? How does a Mennonite volunteers who want to be involved in the correctional service, and it's a horizontal society, work with a vertical society that is a chain of command? And the reason it was able to be implemented was because the mission statement also said that volunteers and family members of offenders are integral in the goal of reintegration. And so there was a lot of opportunity, and there were a lot of Mennonite volunteers then that became involved at a variety of levels within the correctional service. A very positive attitude in terms of providing opportunities for change. Now, I've divided the Mennonite involvement into 7 categories. I'm leaving the 8th one out that Alex Teppelman mentioned yesterday, called retributive justice, which is an eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth. He did mention that in his speech, and I'm leaving that simply beside, because that has been replaced generally with the idea of restorative justice rather than punitive justice, and that's a little bit. But all of these include our words, so just so you know. So it's for your aid. So the 7 words are restraint, rehabilitation, reintegration, reduction of harm, restitution, restorative justice, and reconciliation. I would say that all of those are necessary sometimes to make sure that we know and are clear about how we are getting involved in the correctional service and what are we helping with. The 2 most famous examples of restraint, which has to do with the prison system, of course, is someone who's going to be talking about this next, Edwin Epp, regarding his dad, Edgar Epp, who was a warden in the 1960s in the Saskatchewan Penitentiary in Prince Albert. And in 1965, he refused to hang a person who was on death row and dismantled the gallows. Anyway, he's going to tell about that. And that was 11 years before the death penalty was abolished, I think in 1976, something like that. I worked as a chaplain, so there were lots of chaplains involved. There was just last week, actually this last few days, I learned about a Mennonite chaplain that was in Stony Mountain in the 60s, and I think there was a Dave Brown who worked in Stony Mountain in the early 80s. And so there's chaplains are another way in getting involved, and various Mennonite chaplains became involved. I'm just going to tell you one short anecdote or about what happened. I worked in the Quebec system. My mentor was Tillman Martin, who was a chaplain. He was a missionary in Quebec in the 50s and started various French churches together with Harold Reeser and their families. And he became a chaplain. And the reason that he became a chaplain was that there was a conflict between chaplains in the institutions. And so what was happening is that the regional chaplain was a devout Catholic. 80 to 90% of the inmates are Catholic in Quebec. And so the institutional chaplain was Catholic. And so they didn't know exactly how to hire a Protestant chaplain. Didn't really know that much about Protestants, but there was a Pentecostal revival going on in Quebec during that time, where a lot of Catholics became Pentecostals. And so the Pentecostal chaplain who was hired decided, that's great. So he brought a bathtub into the prison and simply rebaptized Catholics and asked them to sign abjurement forms to make sure that they had renounced. So I don't know, that might be close to Anabaptism, it may not. You can decide. We can get into martyrdom next. But so Tillman was hired simply because he was from a no-name denomination that didn't know anything about Anglicanism and everything, and he was then asked to solve this problem. And in fact, I also inherited that problem, where I had inmates who didn't understand a word of English attend all of my Protestant services, which were in English. So it made it interesting. Rehabilitation was also very important. Correctional Service established programs for offenders and mandated them in the early 80s or late 80s, I guess. And so all offenders had to take programs that related to their offenses. And then in the evenings, the Alcoholics Anonymous, Narcotics Anonymous, Celebrate Recovery services, Christopher Leadership courses, Alternatives to Violence courses, etc., all run by volunteers. And so Mennonites could be involved in this goal. In fact, Mennonites then took the mission statement seriously of reintegration. And so as we go down this list, suddenly we're all involved in some justice issues that look quite different than simply being involved in prison work. The most important aspect of the rehabilitation program, I think, in Mennonitism was the M2W2 program, where volunteers were matched man to man and woman to woman, or P2 program, person to person. And these were started by MCC in Ontario, here in Manitoba and Saskatchewan, in Alberta and in BC, virtually in the beginning of the 70s, and was and continues to be a very successful program of normalizing life. So the inmate, when they meet with the M2 person, that they are then talking about their families and life outside, and so are not too enmeshed in or obsessed about the prison dynamics that are going on, but has a hope then somehow that if they can make friends with citizens in the community, that somehow then that can be related to reintegration and becoming a law-abiding citizen when they return. And so reintegration is my next category, and there were a lot of community chaplains that were hired by MCC, a lot of Mennonite institutions here, Initiative for Just Communities, Parkland Restorative Justice Association in Saskatchewan, Community Justice Ministries in Calgary, and the M2 program in BC, all also followed along and began hiring community chaplains who interviewed prisoners, and when they got out, then they helped them find a job and reintegrate into society. One of the programs that arose out of this is the Circles of Support and Accountability, in which high-risk offenders were accompanied when they got released into the community, and a group of volunteers would form a circle of friendship around them and also accountability. The reason that this was a bit controversial was that they were high-risk offenders. And as high-risk offenders, often they would either deny their crimes, would refuse to take programming, were susceptible because of mental illness maybe or whatever, very impulsive behaviors in the community. And so they would not be allowed parole at 1/3 of their sentence. They would not be allowed to leave the institution at 2/3 of their sentence, which is statutory release, which actually they're mandated, all inmates are mandated to leave at that time. But when you're deemed high risk, you can't. So you complete the whole sentence, and then the Correctional Service asks the provincial government to intervene. A provincial judge meets with the offender after they have finished their federal sentence and mandates him 810 order. It's a peace order between the inmate or offender and society, that the offender will not do any more harm. And so, in fact, and then they work with a high-risk police unit in the city, along with a psychiatric hospital in terms of counseling, and often then they'll wear bracelets in order so that they can be monitored. And so this is simply part of what COSAs, Circle Support and Accountability, are involved with. Now, what I've called this is not reintegration so much as reduction of harm. Oh, I have 1 minute left? All right. So the reduction of harm means then that it's not a matter of restorative justice per se, that they're meeting with their offender, but that volunteers are now committed not only to be friends with the offender, but keeping society safe. We think of the famous probation officers in Elmira that started restitution for offenders, in which they had vandalized Mennonite communities, and so these two probation officers were able to put them together and have restitution. Often restitution has been used in Calgary or community conferencing sessions, in which then there's an ability for them to actually provide restitution. Offenders who have crashed vehicles, etc., like that, makes it a little bit more difficult. We come now to restorative justice. We think of Dave Gustafson in BC and Vern Redicup-Neufeld in Ottawa, and all the other restorative justice, where then now there's a possibility of the victims or offenders actually meeting together. We think of the Ontario one, VORP, Victims and Offenders Reconciliation Process. And so there is a real sense of idealism a little bit that Mennonites also have, that restorative justice and reconciliation is possible, but what I suggest in this article, that these are penultimate goals sometimes, that they're not always reachable, but that they are really something that keeps us, that true reconciliation and restorative justice can happen. Thank you very much.
do I go backwards? Perfect. Well, good afternoon. I would like to thank those that encouraged me to attend and present at this conference. My father, Edgar, would be both proud and amazed that I am doing this. He'd also be taken aback and perplexed that a presentation would be made about him, as he was not one to talk about himself. We've heard from many experts on various topics at this conference. If I were to give a talk on my expertise, you'd be listening to one on perhaps improved techniques and the use of molecular markers for crop improvement in canola. But I'm sure much to your relief, I'm here to give voice to an expert on the conference theme. So the theme of this conference is Mennonites and the justice system. And I'd like to share some reflections through the life and witness of my father, Edgar Willis Epp, who spent his lifetime devoted to making a difference in corrections and society as a whole. It has been both rewarding and difficult going through the process of researching someone I knew well, but for only 31 years. And from a totally different perspective. I never worked with my dad at his place of employment, and so I rarely saw him in this environment. I was also never incarcerated, so I didn't see him from the other side either. I want to start with the verse that shaped his life, the verse engraved on his gravestone. He has shown you, O mortal, what is good. And what does the Lord require of you? To act justly, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with your God. Micah 6, verse 8. Those words weren't just a motto for him, they were a guide for how he lived and led. Over the course of his career, Edgar served as a social worker, church pastor, prison superintendent, a warden, and eventually Deputy Minister of Corrections in British Columbia. Later, he worked as Executive Director for the Mennonite Central Committee, Saskatchewan, and in his last position as Dean and head of the School of Social Work at the Saskatchewan Indian Federated College, now named the First Nations University of Canada. Originally, Dad was headed to a career being a social worker with children, but after having his first 4 children, he quickly pivoted and turned to corrections. Dad was a man focused on making a difference, and he served faithfully, living out Micah's call in places where justice, mercy, and humility are often hard to find, in prisons, in government, in education, in community, and in the church. This afternoon, I want to tell you some of his story, and along the way ask, what does it mean for us, as Mennonites, as people of faith, to act justly, to love mercy, and to walk humbly in our engagement with the justice system and with society in general? When Micah talks about justice, he's not just talking about rules and punishments. He's talking about fairness, about dignity, about relationships being set right. My dad wrestled with this from the very beginning of his career in corrections. In 1965, when he was to become superintendent of the Prince Albert Correctional Center, he wrote to his brothers and sisters about the conflict he felt, writing, "It has dawned on me that this is somewhat of a new era for a Mennonite to be getting into. There might be situations where I would be faced with some conflict of interest as far as my belief in non-resistance and of carrying out the law is concerned. Right at this moment, there is a man in the institution who has been sentenced to die. Since I am against the taking of a human life, should I resign in protest? I hope and pray that I shall never be faced with that decision." That's the tension he carried, a Mennonite, an abolitionist, called to serve in a system where capital punishment was still entrenched in Canadian law. And in that same prison, the gallows still stood, as seen in the picture at the top right, with my dad and 2 local pastors standing below the drop. The drop height, incidentally, was determined by the weight of the prisoner, who had to be in good shape, well-fed, ready to die, and their weight was taken to ensure a quick snap of the neck. Gruesome indeed. As superintendent, he ordered the gallows dismantled, a full 10 or 11 years before Canada abolished the death penalty. For him, that was the act of justice saying, "This doesn't belong here," or anywhere for that matter. Incidentally, the man sentenced to be hung had his sentence commuted. Dad then turned the gallows into a recreation room after the dismantling, something that always made him smile when he told that story. A few years later, as warden of Haney Correctional Center, he faced another choice. The prison had firearms that were loaded and to be used as a threat to prisoners. In his role as warden, he refused to authorize and purchase live ammunition, stating, "Violence cannot be solved with violence." He also looked closely at who are the people filling our prisons. In a talk from the 1970s, he said, "Poor people don't make the laws. Young people don't make laws. Ethnic minorities do not make laws. And yet when we look into our prisons and we find predominantly poor people, young people, and ethnic minorities. So who are the laws for?" For him, justice wasn't simply about enforcing the law. It was about naming the deeper iniquities, about protecting dignity, and about refusing to cooperate with cruelty, stating, "Striving to do justice in accordance with God's righteousness has very profound implications for how we deal with the conflict in our homes, in our congregations, in our communities, and in the world at large. Our response to those who transgress is not to condemn or punish, but to forgive and to restore, overcoming evil with good." These words being based on Romans 12, verse 14 through 21. And that was his way of striving to live Micah's call, to act justly. So if justice is about fairness and dignity, mercy is about compassion and kindness. When Dad became warden at Haney Correctional Center, instead of building a system of force, he insisted on finding different ways to respond. That commitment was tested when a riot broke out at the Institute, when our family was heading out for a seemingly rare picnic together. We had only just left on our way when the CB radio in the car came to life, and it was announced that a riot was in progress. Hands up if you remember CB radios. We were like the only ones in town that had one, except for the police. We quickly turned around from our picnic. When Dad arrived, the guards were standing with weapons drawn, which of course were useless since all the ammunition had been used up on target practice, and as mentioned earlier, the ammunition was never replaced. Dad first ordered the guns be put away to de-escalate the situation, much to the dismay and disbelief of the guards. He then asked to enter the compound where the rioters were, much to the horror and protest of the guards. He then entered into dialogue directly with the inmates. He listened to them, agreed when they were right, and disagreed with them when they were wrong, and explained things why. The conflict ended, not with bloodshed, but with negotiation. Later, Dad would sit down to a meal with those that had earlier thought to do him harm. The meal, in fact, had been delayed by his orders so that the inmates wouldn't have to miss their noon meal. That was mercy in action. Years later, speaking to the Quaker Committee on Jails and Justice, he was blunt, as my dad often was. Prisons are destructive and expensive failures as a response to crime. We are therefore turning from efforts to reform prisons to efforts to replace them with compassionate and life-affirming responses. Mercy for him didn't mean ignoring wrongdoing. It meant refusing to define people only by their crimes. It meant asking how communities could heal, how offenders and victims could be restored, and how cycles of harm could be broken. This ideology was prominent in his promotion of restorative justice through Mennonite Central Committee. He once described prisons this way: "For every 100 prisoners who went in the front door today, 98 were released out the back door. It's really only a revolving door. Prisons represent a temporary warehouse where goods will eventually come out. But what if those goods are then more spoiled?" That's why he called for alternatives rooted in compassion and restoration. Programs such as restorative justice and diversion and community service. And he would have fully embraced the Indigenous-specific initiatives being practiced today, as his work with First Nations people was very near to his heart. Mercy for him was about creating conditions for healing to reduce the harm caused to all involved. That was his way of striving to live Micah's call, to love mercy. Justice and mercy can't stand on their own. They need humility to hold them together. In 1971, Dad helped draft The Way of Peace for the General Conference Mennonite Church as part of the belief that peace is the will of God, and that as followers of Jesus, we are called to participate in his ministry of justice and peace. Though later in his writing, Lawbreaking and Peacemaking, he admitted that Mennonites hadn't always gotten justice right, saying, "We confess that our understanding of justice has fallen far short of scriptural teaching. Biblical justice, on the other hand, is concerned about peacemaking and reconciliation, the salvation of the offender, forgiveness by the victims of offenses, and for restoration of the wholeness of the community." That's humility, being willing to say, we've fallen short and we need to do better. Dad also challenged the way our society doubled down on failed solutions. In his writing, The Dynamics of Prisons, he pointed out that the first prison sentences 200 years ago were at maximum 6 months. It didn't work, so we doubled it and tripled it, until what used to be 6 months can now be 25 years. And it still doesn't work any better. Yet instead of checking our diagnosis, we have simply increased the dosage. Humility for him was admitting when something doesn't work and having the courage to look for another way. That was his way of striving to live Micah's call, to walk humbly. When I think about Dad's life, I see someone who tried to live Micah 6:8 in places most of us would never choose to go. Though as a child, I used to brag to my friends that my dad was constantly going to jail. He acted justly, dismantling the gallows, refusing to arm guards, naming the deep unfairness of our justice system. He loved mercy, negotiating instead of using force, calling prisons destructive and expensive failures, and pointing us toward restorative responses. He walked humbly with God, confessing where we have fallen short, and reminding us that justice is about reconciliation, forgiveness, and bringing wholeness to community. When Dad left corrections, he brought these same principles to every role he took on. From his work with MCC and their work in victim offender ministries and restorative justice, his political activism, and to his work with First Nations people in his last years. In fact, Dad was still working to bring care and wholeness to others even while he was in palliative care. In one of his talks, Dad echoed the words of Jesus in Luke's Gospel. "He has sent me to proclaim release to the captives, to set at liberty those who are oppressed," Luke 4, verse 18. And that's what guided him. And it's what should still speak to us today as people of faith. Micah 6:8 wasn't only carved in his gravestone, it was carved into his life and showed in the way he lived. So now the question comes to us. What does the Lord require of us? For my dad and my family, it required huge sacrifices. For me alone, it meant 6 different schools in 3 different provinces. And for him and our family, it meant being away from home, many changes of address, long work hours, navigating stressful and dangerous situations, and choosing a difficult and often unpopular path. So what sacrifices are we willing to make? Or perhaps imagine the possibilities as we ask the question for ourselves. What does the Lord require of you? To act justly, love mercy, and walk humbly with God. And I thought of this when this morning session was coming on, that in the spirit of this week of truth and reconciliation, I'd also like to say that my dad was born on Treaty 6 land in Laird, Saskatchewan. And for those interested, there's 2 short films produced called Reserve 107, Reconciliation on the Prairies. It was done in 2016. And a follow-up film, A Path Forward, done in 2025. And these films explore how the young Chippewayan band, Mennonites and Lutherans, are working together and continue to do so, when it was discovered in the 1970s that the land the Mennonites and my father and Lutherans homesteaded on is in fact the former reserve of the young Chippewayan. It is a story of friendship, an attempt to repair the wrongs of the past, something that my dad was involved in its early beginnings. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. Conrad, thank you for the presentation for me. As you can see, the title of my presentation is Mennonites of Los Hawaiies, Quellen Colony in English, and the Prison System, History of the Grupo Evangelista La Prisión, Prison Evangelist Group in English, in Chihuahua, Mexico. The Clan Mennonite Church in Los Hawaiies Colony has a missionary project called Grupo Evangelista La Prisión. This project began in the 1980s with the intention of bringing the gospel to people deprived of their liberty in prison and rehabilitation centers. This presentation is part of the Global Mennonites and the Justice System since 1525's conference. The goal is to show how a contemporary Mennonite congregation has taken on a missionary commitment with the justice system. This is interesting because it is not common for conservative Mennonite churches in Mexico to develop mission direct at the outside population. It is also uncommon for Mennonite to form ties with the state institutions. To read this text, I interviewed 3 representatives of the mission and gathered information from a brochure in which the Clan-minded church presented the history and experience of the prison mission. This brochure was presented at the celebration of the centenary of the arrival of the Mennonites in Mexico. So I will present the origins, transformation, results, and challenges that this mission has experienced over the years. History of the mission. The Grupo Evangelista La Prisión originated in 1985. The school committee of the Clan-minded Church in Los Hawaiies organized a visit to the prison in Ciudad Cuauhtemoc. This visit was part of the end-of-year excursion for high school students. The goal was for the students, after taking an intensive Spanish course, to put their learning into practice through Christian service. The school activity had a positive impact on the students and was recognized by other people in the neighborhood. Later, in 1989, a group of young married couples from the same church took a course, home study, in pastoral theology. Each week, they meet with a tutor, Johann Wall, to discuss what they had learned. Johann encouraged the couple to begin monthly visit to the Cuauhtemoc prison to put their learning into practice. This idea was accepted, and soon 2 members of the church, Mervyn Cornelsen and Eddie Platt, were planning the visits. These visits took place every month and were the foundation of what would eventually become an official mission of the church. In the 1920s, this project to visit the Cuauhtemoc prison was presented to the Clan-minded Church for official acceptance as a mission. The congregation accepted the project and appointed Minister Harold Platt as the person responsible for the mission before the church. A group of 8 church members was chosen to conduct visits 1 Saturday per month, and a leader was appointed from among them to coordinate the group's practical activities. In this first day, Mervyn Cornelsen was the chosen leader. Later, in 1995, Harold was replaced by Milton Leuven as the minister responsible for the mission before the church, and he continues to serve in the capacity to this day. Thus, after Mervyn's leadership, the position has later been held by David Platt, Bernard Rampol, A. Petco, and Eddie Platt. The mission was named Grupo Evangelista La Prisión. The choice of name was influenced by a visit to Los Hawaiies by a Mennonite ministry from the United States, the Gospel Echo Steam Prison Ministry. This ministry shared a report on its work with the Kleingemeinde Church. Along with the name, the mission adopted Matthew 25:36 as its biblical foundation. I was in prison, and you came to me. The mission began to grow and become more complex. Initially, visits were made only the municipal prison in Cuauhtemoc, but later it was decided to also visit the prison in Chihuahua City. The missionaries served both prisons on the same Saturday. In the morning, they served in one, and the afternoon in the other. Years later, a new large penitentiary was built on the outskirts of Chihuahua City, and the old small prison was closed for a time. The group tried to enter the new prison, but faced greater access and control requirements. Faced with these difficulties, they decided to move their visit from the Chihuahua prison to a small municipal prison in Ciudad Guerrero. In the early 2010s, there were changes in the justice system that affected the mission. The prison in Cuauhtemoc and Guerrero changed from municipal control to state administration. This led, on the one hand, to the permanent closure of the small prison in Guerrero, and on the other hand, to more severe restriction for religious groups wishing to enter prisons. The mission was unable to access any prison for a time, but in order to keep their work going, they visited a rehabilitation center for people with addiction problems in Cuauhtemoc itself, called Gran Familia, Big Family in English. This new decision was important because from the one, rehabilitation centers will form part of the project. Shortly thereafter, the missionary group had a meeting with the prison authority to formally request access to prison. The request was approved, and the doors were opened once again. Initially, the missionaries were given permission to enter the large prison in Chihuahua. This prison has a women's section, and the authorities invited the missionary to visit that section as well. This led to the formation of a group of female missionaries from Los Jagüeyes to minister to the female inmates. Later, the old Chihuahua Penitentiary and the Cuauhtemoc Penitentiary approved access for the missionaries. Currently, the mission has 7 groups, 6 male and 1 female, and they carry out their monthly service in different spaces: Cuauhtemoc and Chihuahua prisons, rehabilitation centers in Cuauhtemoc, and juvenile detention centers, and specific ministries for women in Chihuahua. In this way, the mission, which began as a simple scout tribe and then the concert of a small group of young married couples, is now a stable ministry with a wide reach in the region. Mission results. One of the main results of the Grupo Evangelista La Prisión, according to its members, has been constant evangelism and discipleship. The missionaries have brought worship, Bible messages, prayers, and testimony to the inmates. Several inmates have responded positively to these activities and have decided to convert to the Mennonite faith. One of them expressed his testimony by saying, "The men who come to prison no longer exist. A sinner entered prison, but a redeemed person will live." Thus, the convert inmates have undergone discipleship process through the mission. The missionaries have given them Bible study materials so that they can continue to learn and grow in their faith. At the end of each study, the convert inmates have received a diploma for completing their course credits. Therefore, the mission has been both an accompaniment in the inmates' sense of the faith and a source of spiritual development and communion. Yes. Another significant result of the mission has been the community and economic reintegration of some ex-convicts who converted to faith in early 2010s. 3 ex-convicts and their families arrived in Los Hawaii's of their own accord and asked to be involved in productive and spiritual activities in the colony. The missionaries mainly helped them find employment and attend the Kleingemeinde Church by translating the sermons from Germany into Spanish. According to reports from missionary leaders, this man and others who arrived in subsequent years have chosen to settle in Los Hawaii's to get away from contexts where their criminal past is known and where they are often discriminated against or rejected. Instead, in the colony, they found an opportunity to start a new life, both spiritually and professionally. Therefore, the mission has not only limited itself to preaching the gospel within the prison walls, but has also accompanied ex-convicts on their path to freedom, creating opportunities for a social, spiritual, and economic integration. In 2033, the Kleingemeinde congregation saw the need to offer space for spiritual communion in Spanish for former convicts who had converted and settled in Los Hawaii's with their families. So the church decided to establish a small missionary church with service in Spanish. Thus, the Vida Nueva, New Life in English, church was born. A space initially designed for the ex-convicts, but also for Spanish-speaking workers from the settlers and neighboring communities. At the same time, the Kleingemeinde Church start classes for the children of the Vida Nueva Church. The educational work began with only 3 students and 1 teacher in a makeshift room in a warehouse. Today, the school has grown and has its own building with about 70 students from preschool to high school attend, while the Vida Nueva Church regularly gathers about 50 people for its Sunday service. In this way, the Spanish language church and school, the fruit of the mission project, show how evangelism in the prison transcends its walls to give rise to new and different communities of faith and learning coexisting in this Mennonite community. Final reflection, challenges and lesson learned. Over the course of nearly 4 decades, the results of the missionary project have presented challenges and lessons learned not only for the Kleingemeinde Church, but also for the community of Los Hawaii's. One significant lesson has been the incorporation of believers from other local churches into the prison mission. Although they do not represent the numerical majority, and leadership always rests with members of the Kleingemeinde Church, this collaboration has been seen as a sign of fellowship and cooperation between churches with different visions. It is not common for different Mennonite denominations to work together on the same project. The ministry has also faced significant challenges. Not all ex-convicts were able to adapt to life within the colony or to church practice, especially on sensitive issues as divorce and remarriage. Nor has it always been easy to integrate the families who accompany ex-convicts when they settled in Los Hawaii's or to gain the full acceptance of the colony's inhabitants. Once again, ethnic, cultural, and religious difference between the Mennonites and others have led to conflicts that reflect the inherent difficulties of building bridge between disciplinary and traditional environment, such as that of the Hawaii's community, and the complex realities of those who come from contexts of marginalization and crime. The missionary did not initially imagine that the work would extend beyond prison walls and come to represent new ways of relating to their fellow citizens in projects of faith and education. This process has not always been harmonious, but it is the most profound legacy of the Grupo Evangelista a la Prisión's experience. Thanks to Eddie Pled, Milton Leuven, and A. Petco for the interviews, written information, and picture you can see. And thank you all for your attention.
Good afternoon. Greetings from Paraguay on a rainy afternoon with 35 degrees Celsius. The church, the Libertad church, Libertad means freedom, and the prison in Paraguay has been considered a success by the government and by many evangelical people, but it didn't start out with a vision. It didn't start out with a strategy. It didn't even start out with a plan. It started very much like the work in Mexico in the 80s, but instead of with a school class, it started out with 3 Mennonite boys, pastoral kids, who were drug users. And their drug dealer, who was also their friend, was caught by police and brought to the prison, Tacumbú. Tacumbú had a name in Paraguay as the worst prison. It's also the biggest state prison that we have. And so these 3 boys, they went to visit their friend, and what they saw were deplorable living conditions in that prison. So they said something has to be done, but the only thing that they could think of what should be done is what they had seen their fathers do when they went to preach to the poor and to the needy people in Paraguay. So one of them said, we have to bring them the gospel. And one said, I can use the movie projector from my dad and we can show them a Christian movie from Billy Graham. But the other one said, well, someone has to preach them, and we can't do that because we are not converted ourselves. We need someone who is a Christian. So they went to a Bible college. They said there's a crazy young boy. He is, for sure he would be willing to preach. So these 4 teenage boys were the ones who started their work in prison. They went there, preached the gospel, showed movies, and the unthinkable happened. People became Christians. People converted. And so now the church had a problem because some of the boys who were not church members had started a ministry. And what do you do now with the people that are Christians? So in the 80s, the only thing that was done in the prison was preaching, selling some artwork. What they did, one of them is like these things made out of cow horn, which are called guampas. In Paraguay, they are used to drink mate and tereré. That was the only thing at that time what was fabricated in the prison. In the 90s, new pastor in the church decided they will take on that work that these young boys had started. By the way, these teenage boys all became really converted later on and have been went into church ministry. One of them became pastor of our church. One became a missionary, and so on. So they were really converted later on. In the 90s, suddenly some of the inmates asked if they could be baptized. And that was a problem for the church because they were not prepared for that question. So one of the things is where will they be baptized? The other thing is in which church will they become members? So the people, the inmates, didn't know that was a problem for the church. So they were careless, but in the church that started huge discussions. How will we do? How could we have a church in jail, in the prison, until finally it happened and a church was established and first people were baptized. Sometimes I say jokingly, this is the only real Mennonite Brethren church in the world because it has only brethren. There are no women in the prison, and so there are no church members, female church members there. This church was led by a convicted murderer within the prison. He became a Christian, and he was the right person on the right spot. So for 20 years, that church was led by this man. By the way, he was released, and he wasn't always a prisoner during this time. Starting with this new century, the inmates, the Christian inmates, used the vacation time of their pastor and asked the prison director if they could have their own dorm in the prison, only with Christians. So for sure, maybe you and I myself ask, why would they do that? Why would they go out? Because the salt is supposed to be in the world and not all together in one dorm, even if the dorm is for 120 inmates. But it was mainly for security reasons. At that point, the murder rate was high in the prison. So they wanted to be together with their fellow Christians, and the prison director gave them the permission. So when the pastor returned from his holidays, he found that 120 inmates had occupied one dorm, all of them from Christians, were Christians. Later on, the government handed over one dorm after another to the church. So after a time, we got 4 dorms, each one with 120 inmates, that the government said, this is your job, you control them, you handle them. We have enough work with the rest of the prison. The prison was built for 800 inmates at the beginning. Later on, it was some buildings were added until 1,700 inmates could fit in there. But occasionally, over 4,000 inmates were put in that same prison. So many didn't have even beds to sleep in or even cells that could hold them. In the 2000s, we started a program of re-socialization, which had the goal to prepare inmates to return to the real world. And how do you do it? Providing education and work, which should be the government responsibilities. According to the law in Paraguay, the government is responsible to provide education to all inmates, but it doesn't happen. So we started a school, and until this day, everyone who wants to finish their school, be it primary school or be it secondary school or even go to college, is coming into our dorms, into our part of the jail, because the government is not doing their part. So we also started to give them work and to teach them carpentry. There are shoemakers, there are blacksmiths, even people who operate a welder, with which they could break easily out of prison. But the government trusts us so much that our inmates can have a welder there. Our church has built several buildings within the prison, also some work that the government should have done. The most special moment, I don't know if the most, but was when my predecessor, the former missions pastor, tried to explain the church that we had to build some private rooms for the for the marital visits there in our part, because when the wives came to visit their husbands, of course they wanted to have some privacy. So he didn't know how to explain the church that we will build a Mennonite motel there where people could have sex and there when they came to visit. He was blushing the whole time, and so it was a little bit funny for us younger people there. In the 2010s, we realized we will be here for the long haul, and so we started training church workers to the Instituto Aquila and Priscilla, which is an institute that goes to the people, does not expect people to come to a central building. And we were training for jobs and also offered college education. In the 20s, new challenges arose, especially when a cartel boss, a drug cartel boss, was in prison, and he ruled the prison from inside with his people. Luckily, he was very fond of the church. He liked us. He liked the pastors. He liked the order that we had in there. He even came sometimes to our worship services. But of course, I shouldn't say of course. Unfortunately, he didn't convert. But he had the whole control of the building. He held the government hostage with threatening to kill other inmates if they will intervene. But after a while, it happened. The government took back the prison, and now there are all the time the government changes the rules, which is, well, we have just to live with it. We know that we don't owe anything in the prison, even though we have spent more than $2 million in the last 20 years in prison in different buildings, but nothing is on our name. We have an agreement with the government, but the day when they tell us you go out, we have to leave there. So at this point, we have our church is paying the director for the resocialization program, which oversees all the education thing and all the work. Then we have a pastor, full-time pastor from outside. He is not an inmate. He is on payroll from our church, and 4 chaplains. So at this point, we have 6 persons working full-time in the prison. And was it successful or not? I don't know how we want to measure it. About 25% of the inmates in our dorms are church members. So not everyone who lives in our dorms is a church member. We don't require them to become church members. We don't require them to convert to Christ. They are able to live in our dorms whenever they are willing to follow the rules that we have there. If the recidivism rate, I had to find this word, recidivism, I don't know if it's pronounced correctly, but it means how many people come back to jail after they are released. If that's any indication, then it has been a success, because from our program, there are 12% of people who, after they are released, they come back to jail because they do some bad stuff again. But compared to the government-controlled part of the prison and of the other prisons, it's very little, because they have 75%. So whenever people ask me if I can show statistically that the Holy Spirit has power, I tell them, I can show you a place where you can see it, and I can prove it. Because 75% without Christ and 12% with Christ, it's a huge difference. Many former inmates today have healthy families, have a stable job, and are church members. Former inmates have planted at least 7 churches. That's the ones that we know. Probably there are many more. But according to Matthew 25, as already said, Emmanuel, we visited Jesus when he was in prison. That's the most important part. And since I have only one screen, I couldn't show you the pictures during my presentation. I show you something now very quickly. if it works. So this is a daily worship service outside because we don't have, our church isn't big enough to hold all the people. This is on a Sunday because you see some women there. Again, daily worship service outside in the main yard. This is the Sunday worship service, which is held at the church because they're come mostly the members of the church with their visitors, their wives, their mothers, and so on. This is a day of baptism, and one of the guys, that's me there. This is one of the typical baptisms that we are holding. Students of the Aquila and Priscilla Institute, that is there since 2012 continually. There are always new students coming in. This is Christmas dinner, even if it doesn't look much like it, but paid by a Mennonite businessman, a huge barbecue for all of the inmates. And as you can see, they all seem very happy by it. The church in the Libertad Church is the only church where we are happy when we lose members, because that means they are released and going into freedom and have real physical liberty, not just spiritual. Thank you very much for your attention and for the opportunity to present our ministry from Paraguay.
Thanks very much to each of the panelists for interesting presentations. We have a bit of time for questions. There's roving mics here.
Thank you very much also to Martin, who I can't see right now. I'm fascinated by the word conversion that came up. So we have reports of 2 ministries that include conversion as part of their purpose, and we have representatives of chaplaincy and prison wardens who presumably are not converting. And I'm just wondering, how do chaplains and prison wardens regard groups that come in who are all about conversion? And how do the ministries that come into prison seeking converts, how do they feel received by the chaplains and the institution? Obviously, in Paraguay, you are welcomed with open arms, that you are kind of infiltrating prison with a church. It's fascinating. But so how do chaplains and wardens regard converting groups, and how do converting groups experience the institution?
Who are you asking? Yeah, I think conversion is simply a part of human life, and I think everybody's free to convert in the prison as freely as they are outside. So it's just a matter of navigating that. Because if you're trying to, we had Jehovah's Witnesses come regularly, we had Mormons regularly, we had imams, Rastafarians, etc. And so there's a freedom to be a part of every of those groups if they want to participate. We don't have initiation rites in the sense of the baptism, because that can become quite political in between Catholics and Protestants, for example. That was the issue. So we simply navigate that. We ended up having, I had weddings outside with Pentecostal ex-inmates, and they were baptized that day before they were married, things like that. So it's just a matter of navigating it. I think conversion is a natural part of life, and inmates are as free to convert as anybody else to another religion, and we navigate that. So.
Hi, my name's James. Thank you all for those riveting presentations. I have a question for you, Mr. Epp. When you researched your father's life, it seems remarkable to me that, was it 11 years before Canada abolished the death penalty? Your father dismantled the gallows? in your research, did he encounter massive resistance to that? Because it seems to me that if it was the law, and Saskatchewan is a pretty conservative province, I would suggest, that he would have confronted a lot of pressure to live up to what he believed. Could you talk about that if you learned any of that?
Well, I would say that it was the law, but it wasn't necessarily the law to actually have a gallows. You didn't have to have the gallows necessarily in an institution that you ran. So the dismantling of the gallows, I would say, would be, it was under his jurisdiction to make the place that he was in charge of, to do policy in the place he was in charge of. So I don't know if he met massive, like an uprising or resistance to that. And I think for my dad, I don't think it would have mattered. I think he would have just gone ahead and done it because he was placed in charge of some place, and so that's how he saw fit to run it. So.
I have a question for Emmanuel. The New Life Church for ex-convicts, how hard or how easy was it to convince the Mennonite church members to fund it?
Yeah, just a quick response. What Emmanuel was saying, there was a minority that was opposed to constructing that church and funding that church within the community of Los Aguayas in the colony, but the majority was in favor, and so it ended up moving forward.
Okay. Since there's a bit of a gap, I'm going to push a little bit more on my question. The cynic in me would say the institution says, oh good, we got people coming in here, they're going to convert some troublemakers and they're going to become Christian, and so now they're going to be all well behaved, and they would take a very utilitarian approach to people who come in to convert. Do especially Emmanuel and Martin, do you perceive anything like that from the part of the institution? They are just happy that there's people who come in and create less troublemakers for them, or are they genuinely supportive of conversion from maybe their own personal Christian perspective, or even maybe in Paraguay and Mexico there is still a stronger influence of the church in prisons and so on?
I will let Emmanuel go first.
Las autoridades de la penitenciaría sienten que cuando entran grupos religiosos a la cárcel, los convictos están más tranquilos y no hacen tantos problemas dentro de la cárcel. Esa es una razón que yo he escuchado.
Yeah, it might be the cynical reason you suggested, that the authorities at the prisons saw that when religious groups were coming in and working with convicts in the prison system, that they were more tranquil, more calm, and less likely to cause trouble. So for the state, this was an opportunity to reduce their costs.
Yes, you're absolutely right with your question. The government sees our work as helping them to reduce criminality and to make dangerous people less dangerous. And since they are not able to do it, they are happy that the church is doing it. And we know the church is not doing it. We believe that God's Spirit is doing the work in the people. And so we do not consider ourselves to changing people's religion, because people who go into jail, it doesn't matter which religion they have, they are not obeying it. So we are just preaching the gospel, and people realize that they did not live according to God's plan for them, and that's what they want to change. I have to say also that not all conversions are genuine. People in the prison realize that church members get released more quickly by the judges than those who are not church members. So we have to do a very thorough exam of those people who ask for baptism. In our churches outside of the prison, we are very happy if someone wants to be baptized, and we don't ask too many questions. But in the prison, you have to do several rounds of testimonies and questioning, and normally when we say at that time there will be baptism, about 50 persons sign up. And by the end, when they have done the 3 rounds of testimonies and examination, about 15 to 20 remain. And the other ones, we tell them to wait a little more, and so they have to wait. And if someone of them is angry about that, it's the surest sign that he wasn't ready for baptism.
This is for Martin. I guess I'm not surprised. I am appalled that you have proof beyond any doubt that your approach is working, and yet the government refuses to provide funding. Instead of saying what you have is so good, we will save money for every taxpayer in this country if we start supporting what they're doing. And I'm just wondering if you see the government changing its views at all.
Yeah, how shall I say it? They trust the Mennonites so much and say whatever we are not doing, they will do it. So why should we spend money on things that the church can do? So that is their mindset and worldview, very different. I agree fully with you that the government should say, well, this is something we want to do. And I can tell you they have offered us all 14 prisons in Paraguay to do the same work, but on our own budget. Yeah. And we don't, it's not even the money that prevents us from doing it, it's just the lack of trained people and people willing to do the work. If not, we could be doing it in all prisons in Paraguay. At this point, there are 4 prisons in Paraguay from the 14 prisons that have Mennonites working in it, but there are still 10 who don't have it.
Donald, I think in the beginning of your presentation, you used the phrase de-escalating violence was one of your reasons for being involved in the prison system. I worked in Stony Mountain for a brief period of time, and I found that the security and the classification officers were very much into escalating violence as much as they could in very minimalistic kind of ways, by calling inmates by number instead of by name, by ridiculing them, by making little digs at them. And it seemed they talked always about inmates being job security. So the more you antagonize the inmates to the point where they would eventually rebel and have a big incident, then the staff could ask for more money, for better working conditions, that kind of thing. I saw a lot of that, little subtle kinds of dehumanizing of the inmates. And so that was the opposite of what your work was, obviously, was de-escalating that, but I saw the opposite amongst the staff, which was very difficult.
Are you talking to me, or?
Anybody that wants to answer that is fine, but you had mentioned the de-escalating violence.
Yeah, the dynamic within a prison, anyone who's entered a prison realizes that we're living under a different type of dynamic of control, of repression at some levels. Usually that comes back to bite the staff that do that. Staff who do escalate violence, generally other staff members do not want to work with them, simply because that staff member is putting other staff members in danger. And so peer pressure, I mean, for lack of a better word, is effective. And I know a lot of staff members have resigned or quit, or forced to quit because of that example. Obviously, in high security institutions, yeah, I mean, you can feel the violence around you without saying anything, and the type of things that can happen. But anyway, I'm a bit of a too optimistic type of guy, who I always try to help, in that sense. And I think the Correctional Service itself is committed to de-escalation. The warden does not want staff to escalate the violence. And so, regardless of that situation, it's a matter of the warden trying to work at that situation to de-escalate it, because a riot could easily happen. So, and I've seen wardens in the Quebec system. I was involved in a variety of incidents where the wardens were very, very effective in de-escalating the violence.
All right, I think that brings our time to a close. We have about 5 minutes to get up and stretch before the next presentation. Can you please join me again in thanking our panelists.